So this is video 13 for the production systems and the nitrogen cycle notes about part 1, which is on the production systems. So there are different ways in which we can grow foods. And the first alternative methods that we're going to look at are use of organic techniques and inorganic techniques. So what are these two different production systems? Well, organic is growing foods without using chemicals, or at least a limited use of them. There are certain guidelines and rules set down that state that certain limits to fertilizers, for example, can be used, that the ground can't have had chemicals on them in a given amount of years, and if it's to do with animals, that they can't be fed foods that have been grown inorganically. But for a more easier description, we don't tend to use chemicals such as insecticides, herbicides, fertilizers with organics, or use them on a limited amount, whereas with inorganic foods we use our chemicals. So organic crops, controlling weeds, we might use what we call a cultural technique, which is to grow plants that have got wide leaves that crawl along the ground, and so they smother the weeds for the other plants that we're growing alongside them. On the other hand, with inorganic, we'd use a herbicide, a chemical which destroys plants and is toxic to them. With organic, to control pesticides, we might use biological control, which is to use an organism that feeds off the pests. A lovely example is the ladybird, which will target aphids that are on a particular plant. In inorganic, we use another chemical called a pesticide, which we spray on the plant, and it'll kill all the harmful pests, or some of them. And finally then, in fertilizers, organic, we might apply something like manure, which is a natural means of giving nitrogen to the plants. Whereas with inorganic, we can use certain fertilizers, which will give them the nutrients they need in the right amount. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of these? Well, quality of the food is in big debate at the moment. Some people say that organic foods taste better than inorganic, and some people say there's no difference. The main opinion at the moment is this is what we call a placebo effect, in that organic foods don't taste any better, but because people believe this, they'll think that the texture and the taste is nicer. So in the end, people will tend to buy organic crops when they want a food that tastes nice, even though it isn't necessarily better. Costs then, well, with organic crops, they're certainly a lot cheaper. There's less labour involved, less things that have to be bought, and as a result, the costs are going to be down. Whereas inorganic, we're going to have to purchase those fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, and apply them, usually in large amounts if it's a crop spread out over a wide area, and as a result, our costs are going to be higher. Yield-wise, inorganic wins here. Inorganic will tend to wipe out all the particular pests or weeds, and as a result, yield and growth will be much higher. Organic, on the other hand, using organic techniques, it's very difficult to completely or eradicate the pests, or even impossible. So although we can control pests, weeds, etc. to an extent, it won't be quite as high. Another reason as well is that inorganic can use fertilizers that are specific to the plant's needs. So if they're low on potassium, you can give them fertilizers rich in potassium. Organic crops, there aren't many different types of fertilizers we can use, namely usually manure. So that manure doesn't contain a specific amount of a nutrient. Input-wise, Inorganic, we have to put a lot more input into them. Although with organic crops, when they're grown in the garden, for the a house, that does take more work. So, for instance, you might have to pick the caterpillars off, or you might have to go pulling up weeds with a hoe, breaking the roots with a hoe. Sorry. With inorganic crops, on a much larger scale, then a lot of time is going to have to be invested to go across with the sprays. We could be able to use a tractor or some machinery to apply the fertilizers and pesticides, but it's still going to take significantly more time than organic crops. But you can, as I said, you can simply grow another plant alongside, a cultural plant, and that will eradicate the herbs, the weeds. Environment, organic's the winner here. Organic generally doesn't have as many bad effects on the environment as inorganic does. If applied correctly, inorganic foods should be fine, but unfortunately sometimes this isn't the case. Chemicals can enter the food chains when they're eaten by insects that might not be affected by the pesticides or herbicides. They can contaminate foods that will be eaten if it hasn't been applied right. And fertilizers can be washed into waterways where it can damage the water ecosystems through a process called eutrophication. There are ways in which organic can damage the environment. The main way is when biological control is used, and then that organism which we've put in to kill off the pests moves on to other organisms and can damage other food chains. Now, here we've got two different production systems, which are mixed production, where we grow crops alongside livestock, and what we call monoculture, where we grow one plant over a very wide area, so no animals being involved here. Quality of food, just like I said before, monoculture relies on a lot more of chemicals and pesticides, so people tend to think that the quality isn't as good. Again, when you tend to use natural fertilizers, as is the case in mixed production, because you take the manure from the animals to feed the crops, people tend to think that the quality is better, even though that might be a placebo effect. Cost-wise, monoculture, you have to invest a lot in pesticides, herbicides, and a lot of time as well, because the plants are going to be harvested or fertilized over a much wider area. On the other hand, with the mixed production system, animals are a lot less labor intensive out in the fields. The areas where the animals are, you don't tend to apply fertilizers to, because it would harm the animal, or insecticides and things. And the animal is naturally going to apply the fertilizer when walking along. Once the animal is off, you can then grow that grass up to use it for say silage to feed animals, and the animal has naturally fertilized the grass behind them. So costs with monoculture are much higher than mixed production systems. Yield-wise, because of that extra investment in fertilizers and things in the monoculture system and that mass production, you're going to get a higher yield. Animals tend to have a lower yield than plants because animals produce a lot more waste, and that will be going into your final product. So mixed production systems, there's going to be a less of a yield, but you do get two different types of foods coming from it. You get crops and you get animals that can be sold, which can be advantageous. Input, as I said, when animals are out in the field, not very much labour has to be put into them. If you bring them into sheds, then yes, there's a lot more work with them and cleaning out the sheds and so on. But whilst out, it's a lot easier. Whereas with crops, you're going to have to apply fertilizers and mow the fields and harvest it, and a lot of work is going to be put into that in using the tractors and methods to apply the chemicals. Environment, well, this is where the big difference comes in between the two, one of the biggest differences. Monoculture, because it's one crop grown over a wide area, lots of hedgerows will be pulled down in order to have a wider space for the plants to grow in, and it's easier to manoeuvre the larger machinery that's used around. This decreases biodiversity because species which were living in those hedgerows can no longer survive there. Now, in a mixed system where you're going to have livestock, the hedgerows can be particularly useful because they act for shelter for the animals. So remember as well that although fertilizers and things are used in mixed production systems, they're used less than in monoculture, so they don't tend to damage the environment as much. This is a picture of a genetically modified crop. The genetically modified is on the right and the ungenetically modified is on the left. What we do in genetic modification is we take a piece of DNA from one plant or animal and we put it into another one. Now, what the benefit of that is, that piece of DNA may control a characteristic that is beneficial and we want to see in our crops. That piece of DNA controlling a characteristic is known as a gene. So we're removing genes from one plant and putting them into another. Now, an example of this may be resistance to a particular herbicide. So that when we transfer the gene across, the plant we're taking it from that has the resistance, it's putting that resistance into the second plant. And then we can simply apply herbicides to the crops and we know we won't kill the plants that we want. Another example is a pesticide resistance gene, pest resistance gene, where when we apply the resistance, some plants naturally produce a chemical that kills off pests. So this can help to keep pests numbers low. Quality, genetic modification doesn't affect quality in any way, even though some people prefer non-genetic modification. But it's not altering any of the genes that control the taste, and as a result the quality tends to be the same. The only way it can be affected is sometimes when plants are made to grow a lot faster and bigger, it can change their texture, and this is the case when they did genetically modified tomatoes. Cost-wise, there's a lot of money that has to go into genetic modification to start with initially. All the research that goes into it, the laboratory work, and then the processing of all this, that's going to cost a lot of time and labour, and as a result, genetic modified crops are a lot more costly to produce. However, their yield is going to be a lot higher because they've been given this resistance or the increased growth, and all that will increase the amount of food that's produced as a result of it. Labour-wise, as I said, initially a lot of work has to go into the genetically modified crops. Other than that, it's pretty much the same as other systems because genetic modified crops are then grown either organically or inorganically, or they're grown by monoculture or mixed production systems, and the input is going to be the same as those systems. If they're grown inorganically, there's a higher input. If they're grown organically, there's a lower input in labour. Environmentally, of course, there's the same things as before. As I said, grown inorganically, there's the dangers of the chemicals. Organically, there's limited environmental effects. But in relation to the genetic modification, the main environmental damage is if they escape into the wild, they might outcompete natural plants. So if we've inserted a growth gene into a plant, If that escapes into the wild, then it might outcompete natural varieties and wipe them out, affecting the food chain.